Thank you. Well, I was actually expecting the joke with Home Alone, and I was ready to answer on that because we're partially a remote company, so my day essentially looks like being home alone all day long. And actually, one of my last year's New Year's resolution was to tackle my social anxiety and like stage anxiety with doing a stand-up, and well, here I am, right, in December. Well, so why is sales enablement the key ingredient for scaling? I'm not sure I'm actually having an answer, but I'm gonna give you a little bit of my point of view and how we're doing things in a relatively small startup, which is growing super fast, and sometimes it's actually super overwhelming and hard to cope with. So a little bit of background about me. So I used to work in advertising for a while. Then I've been in sales for about 5 years. Then I tried my own business, which didn't really work out. It was a great school anyways. And then I was consulting for about 5 years, startups mostly from Central Eastern Europe. And if you are wondering why I have this weird accent, it's because I'm from Czech Republic. And this is where it comes from. So I was working with all the small, like a lot of small startups from this region. It was usually around 12 to 50 people, where essentially you don't have anything like VP sales. You don't have a big sales motions. And my goal was to help those companies slightly change the mindset and get them ready for the scale that can come if they are going to start expanding even more. After 5 years doing this and working with around 60 startups, I have decided to join this new exciting company that's here to challenge the payments market. And hence I went and joined Kevin. And you probably never heard about us. We are still relatively new. We are on the market for 3 years. In the last year alone, we have grown from 100 people to 300 people. We have managed to secure pretty sizable Series A this year. And I was joining the team essentially in a sales team. So I was leading the Central Eastern Europe region and the sales motion we had over there, which was super useful for me to understand how the market works, to understand what are the customers' challenges, and how we can actually solve them. What was pretty funny is that given my consultancy background, I always go and I try to fill the gaps that I see anywhere. And when I was joining 14 months ago, we essentially didn't have a CRM. We had around 15 salespeople, but there was no CRM. So it was a huge mess. The company was running on spreadsheets. I guess everyone that ever worked for a small startup knows what it is and how it works. And it's crazy. It's a mess. There's no other word for that. So one of the first things that I started doing still as head of CE is that I started implementing Salesforce. We started working on sales onboarding because there was no unified way how to onboard salespeople. And yeah, now I'm here, 6 months into the role. We're still figuring out how to do the things the best way. And actually, for this reason, we were going through a bunch of turbulences, a bunch of reorgs. And at some point, the company has decided, oh, we actually need to focus in this direction. We need to get some processes. We actually need to start being really ready for scaling. And they were like, who could do that? Who actually knows how those things work? I was like, well, not me. Still, there was a decision that we're going to build a department called Sales Enablement. But what sales enablement means for us is pretty wide. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. But in a nutshell, I was going into the role with a very simple vision. My vision was that I will be sitting in a room, enabling people, making them grow, being successful. And a couple weeks into the role, I found out that it feels more like this. It was actually pure hell because there was a lot of priorities from all over. We need to do this with our CRM. We need to launch our onboarding program. We have 2 months for that. I was like, well, you know, normally this can take years, but sure, we're gonna do it. Another interesting thing was that since we are a company originally from Eastern Europe, from Lithuania. My first sales enablement hire for the team was Simonas, sitting over there. And he's actually Lithuanian, and we were looking at how many sales enablement people there are in Lithuania. There was one. And it was him. So it was an interesting challenge to take on. The reason why we really started investing as a company into sales enablement was exactly the fact that there was the clear view that we are starting to really scale, and that we need to make sure everyone is telling the same story, that we need to make sure we have the right tools to do it. We need to make sure the more people we are hiring, they know how we actually do things in order for us to do better reporting, better forecasting, and all of these things. Well, what should founders and sales leaders know before launching sales enablement? That's a good question. And I would say they should understand that things take time. Nothing happens overnight, which is, well, something that we are doing. They're delivering miracles on a daily basis, right? But still, it's sometimes super hard to set the priorities. And yeah, they should understand that things simply take time. We are still in a situation when it's super hard to set up the right metrics to figure out the ROI of our sales enablement efforts, because obviously we have no data. There was no CRM. It was super hard to track how we are actually improving the performance of the sales reps, right? So we are still reporting a lot on the projects that we are delivering. And just to give you an idea about the scope of stuff that we did in the very first quarter that the team existed. And when I'm saying the team, so it's actually divided into two parts. It's sales enablement, it's sales operations, but it's all under kind of called sales enablement. And my idea about hiring for those roles, I was always looking more for people that have experience with sales, but not necessarily that specific field. So Simonas was leading sales teams. His last role, actually, he was internal hire from the company. He was in the business development team. And now he's the sales enablement manager, and everyone is extremely excited about how he's working, including me. Because that's well, hopefully no one will want to hire him from you. So I didn't say anything. My sales operations guys, on the other hand, he's originally a lawyer. And I love when people are curious and they just want to do something that's very interesting for them and where they learn. And my question was, so where do you see, or after being a lawyer and before jumping to sales operations, he was working for a bunch of startups as well in sales roles, building the sales teams, and dealing with his own Salesforce stuff because they didn't have the capacity for having additional hires for that. And my big question was, so what's your take on the similarities of law, sales, and sales operations, right? And he had a very nice answer because he was a criminal defense lawyer. And he told me, well, you know, when you're in sales, you need to uncover the pain under the pain. If you are a defense lawyer, you need to understand whether there is a way how to defend, right? So it's the same. And when we were talking about sales operations, he told me, well, there are similarities because if you are a criminal defense lawyer, you need to make sure that there is not, or you are looking for the small things that are broken in the process of making the case on the prosecutor level, which is what we do in sales operations, right? We are looking at what's broken and we are trying to fix that in a way. But yeah, metrics, costs, and ROI, something that we will be figuring out probably in the upcoming months. We are still more of a running on the projects and delivering them. Since what I mentioned, we are a diverse bunch of people. None of us really was in sales enablement. And for me, personally, the biggest value is that if I speak with the salespeople and if we train them, if we are enabling them, I can tell when they are bullshitting, right? Because I was speaking with those customers. I was selling exactly the same product. I know what are their pains. And yes, it's hard because we are creating a category. We are creating something that didn't exist, but still, there are things where you can clearly tell, well, this is exactly what I would tell my manager if I wasn't able to sell that. So you have this advantage that you have really the insight into when they are telling you the truth and when they are bullshitting. They know how to play the system. You know it because you did it as well, most probably. And another thing is that if you are really coming from the organization, you have very good insight and you have very good credibility because they know that you probably were selling some deals. Well, if you wouldn't, then you probably wouldn't be promoted to another role, right? So, the how, well, I think that when establishing a sales enablement function, it's a lot about trust. You need to get the trust of the company that you're actually going to bring results because it's very hard to really quantify them in the beginning. And you also need to trust back all of the stakeholders that they're going to hire the right people, that they are actually thinking about how we're delivering stuff, that they are giving us the insights on what is needed. So trust is actually one of the really important things from my perspective. When we are building anything, and at this point it was mostly the entire onboarding, which we managed to somehow put together in 2 months, and we got it in a quality that our people team is coming to us and saying, oh, we want to use it for the entire organization. I'm always thinking about one specific thing, and that it's like, if I want to tell the team something, I need to tell it to them in a way that even 5-year-old kid would understand. It's hard, especially if you are having like an infrastructure product and they need to understand the product basics. It's super complex, but, well, that's why we're here, right? Another fun part about this delivery was, again, I'm going to get a bit to the scope of our team and how we actually work, is that when we were developing this product piece of the onboarding, we were thinking, okay, so who's the team that's going to provide us the best materials, right? So we were thinking we're going to work with our marketing team. Well, our marketing team came to the meeting and told us, so how are we guys delivering the message? How are we talking about the product? So we ended up in a situation when we were doing all the product narrative as well. Now it's being used throughout the entire company. So that was quite an interesting experience as well. Another point that I'm always trying to pass to the teams, that every time we are doing any piece of training or any piece of content, we have to state the obvious. People know that it's something that they've heard a million times, but it can ring the bell only on the millionth and first, right? And repeat that. For me, when I'm thinking about what is the real purpose of sales enablement, is really making sure that we as entire organization are telling the same story. And that we know what is really the goal, and even if we have individual goals, how it feeds into the overall one. The one thing we were discussing a lot is kind of a scaled versus individual enablement. And how we're thinking about it is really like the trainings that we provide to all the people, the content that we provide to all the people, and the coaching. And we are still in the game for quite short time, but we know that this is something where we will definitely need to go. But again, resources, right? Everyone is complaining about that. We don't have enough people, or we don't have enough tools, which is another fun thing when you are starting a team, which wasn't even planned in the beginning of the years when the budgets were made. You end up in a situation where every time you want something, you just hear, oh, do you have a budget for that? I'm like, well, you tell me. I didn't even know I'm going to be here. What is extremely important from my perspective as well is to really understand your sales force's motivation on the individual level. If you, and obviously this is not really possible if you have like a sales team of 500,000 people, you can't know this all. But if you are having a smallish sales team, which for us currently is around 25 people, should grow somewhere around 170 next year, it's really important to understand what drives those people. Because only then you can really find a way how to pass the enablement in a way that they will really get it, they will understand. Of course, they will probably forget most of it at some point, as was already mentioned in a couple of the previous presentations. But still, if you understand the motivation and if you touch the motivation, you will probably, you are probably more likely to succeed. Another very interesting or important thing from my perspective is empathy. And this is what I also always want to see with the salespeople. I want them to be curious and to be actually able of showing the empathy and understanding of the real pain of the customer. And when we are thinking about anything that we do, we are always thinking about sales as the customer, and we need to have exactly the same traits, and we need to work exactly the same way. The how, that's another good question. Even though most of the things that we do are still very fresh, so for example, the onboarding is in place for something like 4 months. We have already reiterated 2 times because we are trying to track and improve everything that we do. This is pretty much the only metric that we currently have, how the content is performing. And from my perspective, even when I was still consulting, I was always saying, and this was my qualifying criteria, whether I'm going to work with that company or not, companies need to understand that we're going to be failing and that we're not going to get it right for the first time, maybe for the second time. It may take time. But if we are learning from that and we are improving what we do, we're going to move forward, right? So there's a bunch of kind of irrelevant feedback, slides now because I was talking a bit too much. So always collect feedback, iterate, and iterate again. And now we don't have the slides. So we were iterating too much and too fast, I guess. And since I have already mentioned that for us, sales enablement is essentially every activity that enables sales teams to sell better and more efficiently, we are gathering a bunch of functions, and sometimes it's overwhelming. But we have, under sales enablement, we have the actual sales enablement. We have sales operations. We have incentives, both planning and like the compensation calculations, all of this stuff. And we have pricing, which is pretty interesting because essentially we are able to, well, I'm actually pretty strict on that with all the pricing exceptions, but we are able to influence the performance partially through this as well. Yeah. But the big question that we were always having is if we have sales enablement and sales ops, on certain topics it's very hard to draw the line, where the line should be. And we are really trying to move more towards working extremely closely together because on many things, those teams need to work very closely together. If we have the sales ops team that changes a process and starts doing changes in Salesforce towards medic implementation, for example, which is something that we're doing at this point, we need sales enablement to deliver the training and for people to understand how it actually works, right? Well, how are we building sales enablement? Or is it sales enablement? That's what I was kind of tackling throughout the entire talk. I would say we're kind of more of a RevOps thing, but we call it sales enablement because this is the internal positioning. We are enabling people. And we're trying to make sure that not only the company can grow, but people will grow as well, right? So, yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. And I hope that you will feel more like this rather than the one in the fire.
Thank you, Jindra. That was awesome. And I hope your apprehensions about presenting are now quashed because you did a great job. So let's have, Anonymous is back with another question. Here they are, there we go. What is your top tip for implementing your first company CRM, moving sellers, managers, and operations from XLS?
Well, it will be usually hard for me to answer. Implementing first CRM is super painful thing, especially if you are working with people that have, well, and they all do, right? Different seniority, different experience. So we have, for example, a guy in the team, which is in sales, who used to be a CEO of the previous company where he worked. And it was our competitor. And he never used a CRM. And he has, 30 years of experience? And suddenly, you actually force him to push some data in, right? So there's always a big pushback. And it's hard to explain to people, or, well, it's not, for me, it's very obvious, but again, state the obvious. It's a long process, but ultimately, I think the big benefit or the big point that we are trying to give to the teams why we should be actually using CRM is that ultimately it's making their life easier. And if they want other teams in the company to work better, we need to lead by example, right? So we need to make sure that everything is according to the data standards that we have and that we're kind of collecting everything on one spot. But specific tip, I don't probably really have.
How are we for time? There's a little red thing. I think we
still have some.
We have enough time, don't we? I need to go to Specsavers after this. So for a typical CRO, I like this question. Which comes first, ops or enablement? Or is this chicken and egg? Tariq.
Well, I think it's kind of a chicken and egg. Again, I'd say it depends on how big team you have at that point. And I think it's ideal to kind of find a person that's able to do ops and enablement at the same time initially, and only then you start specializing them. I mean, it's hard, but if you are kind of constrained on resources, it's better to do it with one person, or like, I mean, in most companies, you're probably going to do it yourself, right? So it is, in my opinion, a chicken and egg problem.
I'm going to go for a bit of a merge here because these questions are quite similar. They also include the word track, so that's always a good segue to do that. How do you track motivations and skills gaps, and what and how are you tracking?
So at this point, we are really looking at the activities of the salespeople. Again, we have very limited insight into a lot of things. We have this specific that we are very distributed as a company, and we usually have one sales rep covering specific market in specific language. So doing any kind of shadowing and coaching based on recordings or live calls is extremely hard. So we are looking into the metrics that we are seeing, and the one thing we're actually going to implement after this conference is the sales velocity.
And final question, again, anonymous. Do we think the reasons people don't understand enablement is because it means different things in different companies versus marketing is broadly marketing?
Well, I think the thing is that really sales enablement in every company has different meaning, different scope. And I have a kind of a fun story, and this is an advantage of living in a small country, that for me, I was trying to find a definition of what we actually do. And then I ended up in an interview with Forbes, and they were asking me, what am I actually doing in my role? So I was describing all the stuff that we are responsible for. And what came up in the article was, so he's making sure that the company actually works.